Tonight, it is my great pleasure and delight to introduce Zoe Beloff, who is the artist who created the Emotions Go to Work project that we have on view in Polk Wilson, and who's been a wonderful collaborator for nearly a year with us in making this project happen here at the Ulrich. And we are the North American premier venue for this project. It's been shown in Europe, but it was never shown in the US or Canada or Mexico before, so we feel really fortunate to have been able to make that happen. Zoe is a filmmaker, artist, and educator. She is a professor of media studies at Queens College in New York. She received her BA and MA degrees at Edinburgh University and the College of Art in Edinburgh, where she studied both painting and art history, kind of a joint interest that I think continues as a through line in her career. She then received an MFA in film production from Columbia University in New York and participated in the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. Her work, and this is the reason that I've loved it for a number of years, ever since I learned about it, is at once erudite and imaginative. Through a combination of scholarly pursuits and creative undertakings, she seamlessly merges histories of what was with imaginings of what might have been or might yet be. Her interests are wide-ranging, and her projects are across many media reflect that. So in recent years, she's had solo exhibitions in Colchester, England, Ghent, Belgium, and Marseille and Valence in France with Emotions Go to Work. And in New York, Ghent, Haarlem in the Netherlands, Barcelona, and Blackpool with another earlier project called Dreamland, the Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society and its Circle, 1926 to 1972. Her films have been screened, and again, this is just a selection of venues in the last few years, at Anthology Film Archives and the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, BFI Film Festival in London, and the Rotterdam International Film Festival in the Netherlands. In addition to her other art ventures, Zoe creates books, and we're lucky enough we have a gallery copy in the exhibition, and we also have them for sale in our bookshop, so if you're interested in buying this really beautiful, colorful book that accompanies the exhibition, you're more than welcome to do so tonight, and you'll actually be able to get it signed by the artist. Her other recently published books include Between Worlds, An Asylum Seeker in America, A World Redrawn, Eisenstein and Brecht in Hollywood, and the Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society and their Circle. She's a recipient of numerous grants, which I won't list because I feel like I've done a bunch of lists now. And I just want to conclude by saying that another reason that I so admire Zoe's work is her really deep personal commitment to a fairer world, to social justice, and to representing the underrepresented and the little guy. And that may be an asylum seeker with whom she met and did multiple interviews before illustrating and narrating his story in her recent book, Between Worlds, or that may be us as kind of hapless consumers of technology who need a little help trying to think through all the thorny and complicated issues that come up when we try to think on a large scale about things like the Internet of Things, and that's what Emotions Go to Work is about. She will be with us tonight, and tonight she'll be talking about the history in her own work of Emotions Go to Work and how it came about. She'll also be with us tomorrow in McKnight 210 across the bridge there. So it'll be the third installment in our film series that accompanies the exhibition. It's called Emotions Go to Work, the film series. It was co-curated by Zoe and Rebecca Clement. It's been great fun so far with the previous two installments, and so I hope you'll join us at 6 p.m. in McKnight 210 tomorrow, and then stay for the Q&A with Zoe. And the very last thing I will say is a big thank you to Ron and Lee Starkle. I saw where there's Lee for sponsoring the exhibition, and a thank you to KCAIC, the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission, for a grant that supported Zoe's travel to Wichita today and tomorrow. With that, I'll stop talking and hand the mic over to Zoe.
Okay, so first of all, of course, a huge thank you to Ksenia and to Leslie and to my sponsors and all these people who made this possible. And you kind of rebuilt the exhibition from scratch and invited me here not once but twice. So I'm really flattered and really thrilled and see it as a very beautiful iteration of the exhibition. Yeah, I'm really happy with it. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to do Emotions Go to Work, and try and illuminate a certain train of thought that runs through a series of projects that led up to this show. The key idea is the exploration of the relationship between technology and the mind. I often refer to this as the dream life of technology, not what technology is or was, but how we think through it, how we both shape it in our image, and at the same time, how it in turn changes us on levels both conscious and perhaps more importantly, unconscious. The first image you'll see when you enter the gallery is this one here, a diagram of a woman in the throes of what was called in the 19th century a hysterical attack. It was just one image from a much larger chart, an attempt to describe and codify a mental illness in terms of a sequence of physical movements. In my film, Charming Augustine, that I made back in, I don't remember, 2006, I used the case history of one of these women who was used for the diagram. And I was interested, who was, I should say, I feel like saying incarcerated. That's not the right word for hospital, but it's kind of close to what she was. Incarcerated at the hospital of the Salpêtrière in Paris in the 1880s. I was interested in exploring her story and also showing how it intersected with the history of technology, specifically the beginnings of cinema. And here is a photograph of the actual young woman. She arrived at the age of 15, suffering from what was, as I said, known as hysteria. This encompassed a vast range of symptoms, from the temporary paralysis of a limb or uncontrollable movements to full-scale delirium, where the patient conversed with people that only they could see. What tied, I think, these symptoms together was that they were performed, acted out. One might say that hysteria, like cinema, only existed in the moment of its performance. At that time, doctors wanted to classify mental disturbance by documenting it as carefully as possible, and in doing so had to invent new technological apparatuses. And you'll see this diagram also in the exhibition. It was made by a man called Etienne Jules Marais. Etienne Jules Marais and Edward Muybridge are often credited as the inventors of the photographic apparatuses that made cinema possible. What is less well known, that other photographers like Albert Land, Marais' protege, worked with very similar cameras at the Salpêtrière, while physiologists like Marais attempted to study the mechanics of the body. The photographers at the Salpêtrière aimed to unlock the secret of the patient's mind. And there is Albert Land actually at the photographic apparatus. They're making motion studies, and that's Marais sitting there in the side wearing a top hat. In Charming Augustine, my film, I wanted to show that while Marais may have invented the mechanics of what was to be cinema, it was the doctors and patients at the Salpêtrière that supplied the psychic drive that would give birth to narrative films, that is, films with stories, ultimately to melodrama that would come to flower in the work of early filmmakers like D.W. Griffith. There was nothing new itself in photographing the insane, but in the past, one photograph would suffice to describe a malady. However, since hysteria was an illness that manifested itself through performance, through motion, a single photograph could not possibly hope to capture the symptoms. The first case to be represented with a sequence of photographs was that of Augustine. However, they were far from being instantaneous snapshots. In those days, each photograph required a long exposure time. Because of this, you can't think of them as so much as movement caught on the fly, but defined poses in a similar way that a storyboard or movie stills pare a scene down to just the high points. It was here that her illness pushed photographic technology to its limits and beyond, bringing into existence a strange new hybrid way of seeing, a bridge between past and future. It was a proto-cinema of sequential still images, each representing a key moment of her attack. There is another element in the description of Augustine's case that fascinated me when I read it, and makes it appear to us now like sound cinema before sound existed, and that was dialogue. Again, this has nothing to do with the structure of technology, since sound could not be actually recorded any more than the camera could capture motion. Rather, it is a juxtaposition in the book of the sequence of photographs in conjunction with a text that included transcripts of her dialogue under the influence of either ether or amyl nitrate with people that she could only she could hear. That's a kind of hallucinated dialogue. I made my film about Augustine in part because I felt that men, that is, the technologists of cinema, had gotten all the credit, whereas the women, like Augustine, were presented simply as victims of the medical establishment. I would argue that Augustine and her fellow so-called hysterics collaborated with the doctors and the photographers to create a remarkable series of images and texts that I call melodrama in embryo. So I'm going to show you just a small clip from my film.
I have difficulty breathing. I don't know. I don't want to be sick. I don't want to have any more amyl nitrate.
I feel like I have been lifted up when this takes me.
Qu'est-il donc arrivé? Quelqu'un t'a fait du mal? Quelqu'un t'aurait-il offensé? Mais tu dois me cacher quelque chose. Dis-moi toute la vérité, Mélisande. Laisse le roi.
I am not worthy of your You are not dignified enough for me to like you. There are rats behind. They biting. Mama! I've been forced to tell Papa. Is this how we make little children? How? A baby? But I'm going to tell Mother, if Monsieur C makes me have a baby, Mother announced that she's going to put me in a safe house. Hurry, I have to go. Bitch! Camel ass! Jerk! And you continue! I'm going to tell Papa!
Okay, well, we could get carried away by that, so I'm going to stop it. So the next project I want to talk about that led up to Emotions Go to Work was called The Infernal Dream of Mutt and Jeff. And it also deals with the origins of cinema. This, again, in a lot of ways, as a form of social control. The project began when I was invited to work with a collection of objects from the history of cinema that was housed at the Mucke Museum in Antwerp. I chose, much to people's surprise, what many people might consider the most drab, least glamorous machines. That is, cameras and projectors that were used to make industrial and instructional films from the 1940s and 50s. My installation presented the historical objects and attempted to make visible what we might call their unconscious or their ideological underpinnings. At the center of the installation was a 3-channel video projection. I began with 2 instructional films, Motion Studies Application and Folie à Deux from the early 1950s, that I found when they were being tossed out by a business college in 2006. Motion Studies Application was made to show how to work more efficiently on the assembly line. Folie à Deux is a clinical name for a contagious paranoia, and the film was one of a series made to illustrate how to identify mental disorders. It depicts a mother and daughter in a mental hospital being interviewed by a psychiatrist. I wanted to show that these films were in essence the same film, or rather 2 sides of the same coin. Both films represent people as merely bearers of motion. The productive workers of Motion Studies Application had their dysfunctional double in the institutionalized patients of Folie à Deux, just the way Marais' marching soldier in my exhibition are shadowed by Lance hysterics. I decided to make a 3rd film that would put my 2 industrial films into dialectical motion. And it was here that I turned for inspiration to slapstick cinema, to the work of Chaplin and Buster Keaton. In slapstick, things take on a life of their own. A ladder will swing around and happen to smack a policeman in the face. The gesture made by the ladder operates on the level of a universal language. It is here, I believe, that we enter into the dream life of objects, where the repression of our industrial world erupts. I think of slapstick as a 3rd term, the revolutionary potential hidden between the efficient body of the worker and the disordered body of the emotionally disturbed. Slapstick posits a new relationship between the world of things and the world of people. It begins by destroying the order of the world that we know and leads us where? We don't know, but that is its strength. It doesn't precisely prescribe for us, but says simply, this world can be other than it is. When I shot a 3rd film, and it's a very secretive 3rd film, because it's hard to know quite where it begins and ends, as you'll see, I wanted to create a dialogue between Motion Studies Application and Folie à Deux. I tried to give the objects opportunity to live their own lives. and I did not know until the moment of shooting what exactly they would do. My actor followed instructions to mimic the industrial films and the psychiatric film too far with a mad excess. I wanted to experience what would happen when the tools of production refused to remain hidden and everything went wrong. So we'll see just a little bit. It's 10 minutes long, so I'm just going to show you a fraction of it.
Here, the operator is shown performing the same task by the old method on the left and by the improved method on the right. The operator using the improved method shown on the right finishes first, filling the board in 25 seconds, whereas the old method requires 38 seconds. The operator attempted to work at the same speed or tempo in both cases. Consequently, the savings in time are due entirely to the better method and not to greater speed on the part of the operator. Excessive speed is no substitute for good work method.
We are going to see two patients, mother and daughter, who are suffering from folie à deux, or induced insanity, one of the less common forms of mental disease. This psychosis develops first in one person and is then communicated to one or more other persons who have a close emotional attachment to the one originally affected. It is usually seen in couples of a rather secluded life, dependent on each other. For instance, parent and child, husband and wife, or two spinster sisters. It must be understood that the infection with insanity from one person to another is a purely psychological phenomenon. Consequently, physical separation of the two persons for some time will often suffice to bring about recovery in the one who was secondarily affected. But this is sometimes not practical. Our two patients, for instance, were separated while the daughter was receiving treatment. The mother lost her symptoms, indeed, but became so profoundly depressed because of the separation from her child, the only person in the world for whom she cares, that the two had to be brought together again, even though the daughter's treatment had not been successful.
It seems natural for most people, when observing another person at work, to notice the material the person is handling, or the tools he is using, rather than the motions he makes in doing the job. After one becomes motion-minded, this situation is changed. The observer then notices the motions made by the operator's right hand and those made by the left hand. The object of such analysis is to devise a method that will require the fewest and easiest motions possible.
That's not a lot.
Maybe he had insurance. Why did he say it?
And somebody else wanted to get the money, and that's why they framed you. Is that
Maybe
the
it's
idea?
the money they wanted to get, or maybe they were mixed up in crime with Dr. Kopp or other things. There's a mix-up. That's why I'm done. If there were no crimes being committed, I wouldn't be in here.
Yes.
Don't worry.
You're sure of that?
Yes, definitely.
I'm sure positive.
Yes.
I don't know. Soon I go, that's happened a few times. Soon I go in bed, I feel perfect health.
They can stop it too. They can hurt you for the moment, then they can stop it. I
Yes,
mean,
and I go in bed.
It sounds funny. I know it does.
Soon I
funny,
fall asleep. I feel something happen to me. I can't open my eyes.
They have something, these people, I don't know what it is.
That's
Nobody can
witches.
find them. If you investigate them, you'll find something.
Plain
They
open,
find
that's
something.
witches.
Witches?
Yes.
You
that's
know what witches are?
You know, they're
but they are no
witches.
Well,
and
if they can do things like
You
that,
believe in witches?
I never believed in
I
witches.
believe
I
that.
mean, well, she's
That's
referring.
witches.
She's putting them in that class because it's not natural
How
to
did
do
you
things like
how
that.
did you to her make her sick me too? I fall asleep and I
Since I've told the
my
doctors
eyes
they
and I
left me
feel
alone,
right
I'm all
away.
right.
Yeah, like somebody is strangling me in take
Choking
me
you.
like this. Sometimes it depress my heart. I can't breathe it.
Using rubber finger stalls to facilitate grasping, the operator can now pick up 2 sheets at a time with each hand.
Okay, so let me go on. You can see the whole piece on my website, actually. But so to continue from my thinking on in the Infernal Dream of Mutt and Jeff, I ultimately felt that it was not complete. This installation dwelt too much in the past. It focused too much on Fordist labor in a world that is rapidly changing. Although Fordist labor certainly exists, although much less in this country than in places like China. So when I was invited to create a new exhibition at the Bourse du Travail in Valence, my first thought was to update it. But of course, in the end, by updating it, I had to go back to the beginning and create an entirely new work. This one mapping the dream life of technology from the mid-19th century to the 21st century, and then on into a speculative future. And that's what you see here in Emotions Go to Work. It investigates how our emotions and feelings have been turned into commodities themselves and instrumentalized by global corporations. In our world today, technology is deliberately endowed with a pseudo-emotional life. My installation poses the question, what does the future hold in store for us in a world where people are treated more and more like things, while the billions of gadgets that make up the Internet of Things are increasingly anthropomorphized and granted agency? My exhibition again begins in the world of Augustine's and ends with the Internet of Things. What could they have in common? One must remember that the hysterics with some of the first biomediated bodies, that is, bodies that are a source of information, and documentation of their condition went way beyond just photography. The laboratory at the Salpêtrière contained state-of-the-art technology to interrogate every aspect of these women's bodily functions, blood pressure, pulse, temperature, everything. All this information constitutes what the French philosopher Michel Foucault called biopower. Emotions Go to Work investigate biopower in the collection and deployment of effective data. It is used to tie us ever more closely to the realm of smart objects, our digital companions. It asks, what is at stake in our relationship with the objects that make up the Internet of Things? Do they deliver on their promises of freedom, for instance, from mundane tasks like driving or shopping? Or are they a threat, facilitating corporate control as they ever so gently penetrate ever deeper into our minds and bodies? Do they train us simply to become more efficient consumers and docile citizens? Does the Internet of Things change the very nature of what it is to be human? Is it even possible to imagine a relationship between things and people not based on capitalism or the extraction of surplus value? These are some of the questions that the exhibition poses. At the core of it are three charts that you'll see. The first one here is called an alphabet of the passions. The first, and it shows my drawings based on a series of photographs taken by a man named Duchenne de Boulogne, who was the first person to create a taxonomy of emotions. He called his great series of photographic charts an alphabet of the passions. He stimulated facial expressions by touching people's face with electrodes, and he subsequently assigned each image an emotion. He believed that these emotions, so-called, the ones he assigned, represented a universal language that was a direct reflection of the soul. Though they may seem archaic, they are the forefathers of the emojis that each one of you have on your phones. Emojis may seem very adorable with their candy colors and cute winks. Nonetheless, they have very real ideological effects. They look like tiny gold coins and indeed might be accurately described as a form of emotional currency. They are the interlocutors between global corporations and ourselves, tools that enable companies to harvest emotional data. And because it is fun, we willingly comply. Emojis function as a form of biopolitical power. We can see this at work in Facebook's decision to boil down the emoji set to just 6 animated pictographs that are termed reactions. These reactions represent like, love, haha, wow, sad, and angry. The Facebook engineering team claimed that they just wanted to make it easy for users to, by choosing representations of feelings that were both common and universal. But what happens when the emotional vocabulary becomes constricted and controlled from above? In his novel 1984, George Orwell used the word newspeak for the government's gradual shrinking of vocabulary. Every day, the dictionary got smaller, so that more and more thoughts and ideas became impossible to express and ultimately even to imagine. Today, many of Facebook's 1.9 billion users feel sad and angry in their reactions to the world around them, but they frequently don't have the space or the time or the tools to articulate why. But what will be the faces of the next century? The Internet of Things draws its strength from the great networks of computing power we call the cloud. As more and more aspects of our lives are stored in the so-called cloud, one can imagine these monstrous data clouds sweeping across the skies, taking on human visages, mobile shifting expressions born of the effective data of millions and millions of people. Perhaps one day our emotions will look like this. The figures in my exhibition trace this instrumentalization of emotions that has been an indispensable element in the triumph of capitalism. So again, beginning with Augustine. Today, the symptoms of mental illness are still exhaustively cataloged. This information is a source of biopower used to separate the ill from the well, those who can be employed from those who cannot work. Today, we have internalized the directive to confess, to speak, or to speak whatever we feel, and this desire to share the most intimate aspect of our lives that had to be coaxed out of the hysterics is now the fuel that fires social media. So if this stands for the 19th century, this diagram, man as industrial palace, might stand for the way the relationship between industry and the mind and the body were conceptualized in the middle of last century. This diagram is by the pioneer of information graphics, Fritz Kahn, and the body is depicted as a giant factory. However, this image is not without ideological assumptions. If the body is a factory, then one might also assume that the factory is a body, and its organizational hierarchy with managers in the brain and workers slaving away in the bowels is just as natural as a biological process is, suggesting we can no more change the organization of the factory than we can change the organic makeup of our bodies. Today, the analogy between the body and the machine has inverted again. If in the 20th century the body was conceptualized as a factory, in the 21st, machines are metaphorically endowed with human characteristics. More and more everyday objects like thermostats, TVs, even light bulbs are being referred to as smart and autonomous. Most objects in the Internet of Things appear friendly and protective, like surrogate parents. They keep us safe and bathe us in their warm glow, only mildly chiding us with reminders and notifications. While it might appear they are working for us, it gradually becomes clear that they have the upper hand. It is they who put our emotions to work. For example, every time we rate a piece of technology online, we produce added value. At the same time, these hybrid things don't just perform tasks, they ingest information about us, information that their parent companies use to sell us yet more goods and services. The Predator drone is an extremely smart object designed to track and kill people. But, I ask, are not all the smart objects predators, preying on our desires only to take our money? Alphabet, Inc. is an umbrella organization for a portfolio of companies that encompass technology, life sciences, and finance, of which Google is the best known. Together, they link the networks inside of us to those outside. The alphabet is the bedrock, not only of human thought, but also of biology, in the form of the chemical alphabet DNA. With the aid of, new technologies, Alphabet Inc. aims to penetrate deep into ourselves as sentient beings. One could argue that Alphabet Inc. is setting up a framework to create a great universal language, life subsumed into the circulation and production of capital. We can only speculate how the Internet of Things will change what it means to be human in the 21st century. Perhaps there will come a time, I wonder, when instead of emojis being derived from human expressions, we will find ourselves imitating them, just as a baby learns how to understand and express their emotions from looking at its mother's face. So we can imagine children learning from emojis who look back at them with an unblinking gaze. But emotions may be soon as emoji may be soon as archaic as Egyptian hieroglyphs. Instead of companies tracking our feelings with primitive tools like reactions, their software will be able to interpret our facial expressions and respond to them directly in real time without our knowledge. No, in fact, this is not fantasy. It is starting to happen right now. The physiologist Paul Ekman is a pioneer of this approach. He spent his career studying facial expressions and their reaction to emotion. In the 1960s, he went to a remote part of Papua New Guinea to study the nonverbal behavior of an isolated Stone Age culture. His research proved, according to him, the strongest evidence to date that facial expressions are universal. He wanted to create a database or an atlas of emotions, not just with the hundreds that Duchenne cataloged, but thousands, 10,000 emotions. This was not simply an academic exercise. Ekman put his findings to work. He was an advisor to Emotion Inc., a startup bought by Apple that uses sentiment analysis based on facial expressions to advance emotion-aware computing. And I'm going to show one of their films tomorrow as part of the series. Again, the technology is couched in the language of safety and security. Its customers include not only marketers who want to track the public's reaction to products, but border control and law enforcement looking for new forms of lie detectors. And that's happening right now, as well as the fact, I just read about this all the time, like job interviews are now being passed by AI to decide like what are the most winning human expressions for future employees. They're doing this a lot in South Korea, where they have hundreds and hundreds of applicants for each job, and they're just scanned by AI. And in fact, I read in this article that people are taking classes to learn to have the right demeanor and expression so the AI will like them and give them the job. So this idea that people are starting to train themselves to seduce the machine is not a fantasy. And this is what my video, you can see the whole one in there, talks about here. So the little piece in here where you see those dots, that's because the companies over your face, they trace your emotions by kind of running these dots around the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the things that change, and then use that information algorithmically. So, you can sort of imagine over our own skin, another digital skin that broadcasts our feelings to the company's servers, who claim that they know us better than we know ourselves. These companies trust their algorithms in a way similar to the doctors at the Salpêtrière who believed that a camera cannot lie. But like the doctors, they do not reckon with the fact that people might soon, on an unconscious or conscious level, train them to conform to the software specifications for happiness and confidence, just as the patients at the Salpêtrière began to perform their hysteria. So, in the search for criminals, for instance, computer algorithms will flag the anxious, the sad, the despondent, those whose facial muscles refuse to behave in accordance with this brave new world. And this video, it was actually started out as a promotional video for Watson Internet of Things. You can find it online. And I just made a few subtle changes to maybe bring some of its underlying ideas to the surface. But you can easily find, if you look under Watson Internet of Things, you can find the original video. But my next question is this, and this is my final question, and this is where it can only be a question. Is the march of progress unstoppable? I think it's important to bear in mind that machines, however supposedly smart, do not think in the sense that we think. They do not have consciousness. They do not want anything from us. They do not desire to control us because this concept is completely meaningless to a machine. If the Internet of Things changes our relationship with the world, it is only because we ourselves anthropomorphize these lively objects. It would be naive, I think, that we could just change our world by opening our eyes and seeing the objects around us for what they are, any more than we can somehow step outside ourselves and observe our unconscious from without. But perhaps we might picture new affective relationships between things and people that are not controlled from above or that limit our imagination. I began with some monstrous and threatening clouds. But could we not picture the cloud also as a thought bubble, like the ones in cartoons, that is a wish image? What images, I ask, might inspire us to untether our smart objects from their corporate parents and make common cause with us in a new version of a classless society? And I chose 2 cartoons to help us think about this. 2 humble cartoons, The Little Screw and Ha Ha Ha, from the first half of the 20th century, whose anthropomorphized technological creatures, in their own very different ways, imagine a utopian future. And you can see them both in the exhibition, so I'm not going to play them here. The Little Screw is a cartoon for children. It was directed by Vladislav Sarkovsky in the Soviet Union in 1927. The film depicts a factory where each machine has its own personality, and just like a person, things learn the importance of empathy and sharing. When the big machines insult a little screw, he walks off the job. After that, nothing works right. And so we find the machines, the giant lathes, leaving the factory and searching for the little screw in Moscow, imagined as a pre-modern universe where all is animate. Perhaps the little screw and his friends were born too early. Could they be our guides in another socialist revolution that begins 100 years later? We are not there yet. And perhaps one of our problems lies in the fact that our technology is not yet imbued with enough desire. Its emotional energy is too well regulated, too channeled into work. What is lacking is a wild revolutionary charge. This excess of libidinal energy is exactly the subject of the other cartoon, Ha Ha Ha, made by Max and Dave Fleischer in Brooklyn. It's part of a Betty Boop cartoon that proposes the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, starting appropriately with a 9-to-5 workday in Brooklyn, in which machines become completely hysterical. Could we imagine our own smart technology, suddenly infused by a wild excess of emotion? Perhaps the first step to rewiring our world is to picture possibilities in games and in play, in dreams and in far-fetched fictions, so that we can begin new conversations between people and things. And that is my question to you, and the question that we can't all answer, but we can only imagine. And that's kind of what my exhibition is asking. So I'm going to leave it right there with my friend, the laughing typewriter.